In order to discuss that story further, I'm now joined by Tim Anderson. He is the director of the Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies, joining us from Sydney. Tim, welcome. Thank you for being with us. Well, what do you make of Russia's move recognizing the two breakaway regions as independent republics?
Well, NATO raised the pressure on Russia, and this is the result they got. The idea of a Russian invasion of Ukraine was always absurd in the sense that Russia is the biggest country on earth that needs no land or territory, as Nazi Germany did some generations back. But given that Ukraine has been a type of failed state for the last 8 years, with that coup in Kyiv and Neo Nazis and Blackwater mercenaries joining in the attacks on those breakaway parts of eastern Ukraine, Russia felt that it had to protect that part of Ukraine. Now, you can say it's technically a breach of international law, but of course NATO has been violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of dozens of countries up to this date, including occupying half of West Asian countries and a number of Latin American interventions and African interventions and so on. So really, it has to be seen as a partisan play of politics and not something we can fully understand through simple universal international law.
And what's your reaction and your analysis of the reactions that are actually pouring in from the U.S., Albania, NATO allies? These are some very strong reactions to Russia's move.
Yes, they're strong and they're predictable, and they're all from the one direction, effectively. Those states allied with NATO that have been involved in the interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and so on. Those states really don't have much of a moral platform to talk about Russia's behavior in this respect. It's certainly the failed state in Ukraine posed a threat to Russia for some years, and Russia has not wanted to go beyond its absorption of Crimea into the Lugansk and Donetsk republics. But recognizing those republics is something that it's doing effectively to create a security buffer with all of the aggression that's been coming from NATO through the Ukraine pretext.
Well, at the Security Council's emergency meeting, both the Russian envoy and the Ukrainian envoy, they both expressed that they will remain open to a diplomatic solution to a crisis, but is there a window of opportunity for a diplomatic solution?
There was, because the Minsk agreements of 7 years ago were talking about Ukraine respecting an autonomous process in those eastern parts of Ukraine, in the Donbas region, but they never delivered on it in 7 years, and that's what the Russian president specifically cited. Now, the debate in the Security Council, I suggest, is going to be very predictable. Not entirely clear what China's going to do because, of course, the US has been threatening the sovereignty and territorial integrity of China by arming and occupying part of China, that is to say Taiwan. So in principle, it's not entirely clear which way China is going to jump, but China is a strategic ally of Russia, and Russia is clearly going to veto any possible Security Council move there. So it's only going to deepen the divisions that have come into place since the US began imposing these unilateral coercive measures on dozens of countries. Let's remember, almost half the world now is subject to these economic siege measures, and it doesn't make much sense for the US to say it's going to impose trade embargo on Donbas, because Donbas had no US trade or investment in any case. It was under a blockade for the last 8 years.
And Tim, one last thing that I want to discuss with you. Let's talk about the Minsk agreements. Russia says it is not a party to the agreements, and well, technically, it cannot violate the agreement since it's not a party to it. But Ukraine accuses Russia of violating the agreements. What's your take?
Yes, well, President Putin said that the Minsk agreements had effectively expired because Ukraine had shown no goodwill at all. And of course, that there's a against eastern Ukraine, and particularly that they've been supported by, and NATO has supported the Neo Nazi elements of those attacks, and also the introduction of US mercenaries like Blackwater into those attacks. So that was imposing a terrible risk to Russian security, and I think that Russian agreement with these independent republics is, if anything, going to help stabilize the situation. I think that Ukraine and Europe are simply going to have to get used to it. It may deepen the rift between Russia and Europe, but I think that the Russian government has considered and accepted that risk.
Tim, always a pleasure to have you on Press TV. Thank you so much for joining us. That was Tim Anderson, the director of the Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies from Sydney.